Hi there. I'm Ashley, and I was diagnosed with primary progressive MS in 2022. In this podcast series, we're putting the spotlight on progressive MS because we don't often feel that represented when people talk about MS. So you probably don't need me to tell you that people with MS are a diverse bunch, and that includes those of us with progressive MS. We experience our progressive MS differently, and it's just one part of our identity. Like, I am a bass guitar player whose MS affects my left hand. Tricky. But I get by, and I can still rock out with my band. We played at Brighton Trans Pride last year in front of a crowd of hundreds of people. It was awesome! So, as you may have guessed by now, I am trans. And dealing with that and MS can also be pretty tricky. And I don't really see people like me represented very often. But guess what? There's at least two of us. My guest today is Dr. Cora Sargent, an educational psychologist, podcaster, MSer, trans woman, and overall badass. Now, Cora has relapsing MS while I have progressive MS, but we both are wheelchair users. We both like to see more representation of LGBTQ plus people, so hang out with us for the rest of this episode to find out more. Dr. Cora Sargent, thank you so much for joining us. Lovely to have you.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks so very much for the introduction. This feels like a great opportunity, and I'm just super glad to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us, and let's crack on, shall we? All right, so let's start off. Could you tell me a little bit about your experience of having MS?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I was diagnosed just over 5 years ago, just before the global pandemic. I'd gone numb in one leg, and I went to see my GP. Oddly enough, my GP was like, thought I was just anxious, and I was like, how anxious do you have to be to go numb in one leg? But he was like, he wrote to the neurologist in the end. It wasn't actually him, it was a different GP. But he wrote to them and said, Cora is experiencing numbness in one leg. She discovered this when she was shaving. She had not shaved in some time. And I was like, is that necessary level of detail to share? Like this, it was accurate. Frankly, it was accurate. I hadn't shaved in ages. It was like a jungle down there, and I was deforesting when I discovered that I'd gone numb in one leg. And the rest is history, really. A bunch of MRIs and relapsing remitting diagnosis later. And yeah, here we lie 3 or 4 relapses later. It's been a wild journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've mostly been talking about progressive MS, but relapsing remitting, in a way, to me, it sounds kind of harder because you never know, you can make all the plans in the world, but you never know whether when you wake up, that's going to be the morning when everything's returned. That sounds kind of rough, to be honest.
Yeah, I think there's some privilege in the kind of experience of, like, over time, I feel like my efforts yield progress in terms of like my strength and my mobility. And I think there is something to that, but there is a special kind of anxiety that comes from always like, I said to a friend of mine, she always thought that the relapses were the hard bit. And I don't think it is. I think it's the fear of the relapses that's the hard bit. It's like, it's hard not to interpret all the little things, like any twinge of a muscle, you've fallen asleep on your leg or your leg has fallen asleep on you, or you get pins and needles, or, you get a flash of vision, something weird happens. And it's hard not to interpret that as suddenly the start of something that could be life-changing, and to try to find peace knowing that you're at that kind of risk all the time is hard.
I'm progressive, you're relapsing remitting, but even with that, I think there's quite a lot of crossover. There's quite a lot of similarity between any two people with MS. So right off the bat, what was your experience of kind of transitioning to being a wheelchair user?
Yeah, let's say it's been a wild adventure. I was on Reddit and somebody was saying, my friend has MS and is just so afraid of being stuck in a wheelchair, that kind of phraseology, like bound to a wheelchair or stuck in a wheelchair, and that's the worst thing that could possibly happen. I think I probably would have thought the same thing 10 years ago. And to my mind, it isn't. It's actually been loads of fun. Because the mobility issues, I was on a train to London with friends, and we were like, oh, let's move seats, and the train was in motion, and suddenly, because the train was moving, I couldn't compensate for it, so I was just stumbling and falling, and I ended up sitting on the lap of more than one passenger, like at once, and that was a sort of indicator it was time to move on. I needed to get a wheelchair, and as soon as I got one, like I was like, oh wow, I feel. I mean, when I first got one, I didn't feel free at all because I couldn't move it. Like literally on my freaking pavement outside my flat, I couldn't get more than a few feet, and people were stopping in their cars to help me because I was just like tipping into the road and not knowing how to stop myself. And over time, I just got stronger and stronger, and now it's working out in my chair, like skidding round corners on wet leaves and just tearing up the pavement like an absolute renegade is one of my most fun things to do. I actually just picked up a wheelchair yesterday.
What, like a manual one or electric or
manual? Yeah. Yeah. My old wheelchair was called Firefly. I realized that the ship from Firefly is actually the Serenity. But that chair was always one that was like barely holding together, and bits were falling off it, and somehow got me to my destination. And this one's like lightweight and modern and high tech, and so I call her the Rocinante.
Of course, from The Expanse, or Don Quixote's horse.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, so there's some literature deep cuts and some science fiction going on in this conversation already. So yeah, I agree. I think transitioning to a wheelchair, you kind of have to get used to it, but boy, does it help with like your arm strength and upper body strength, like just kind of moving around the flat, moving around anywhere on my wheelchair, and suddenly I'm really good at opening stuck jars and lifting things. So I guess a little bit of what I wanted to talk about is about healthcare settings and about how easy we found to like access those, the help, that the support that we've gained as part of our journey with MS. How easy has that been to get for you?
I'm going to say I have been overjoyed with the service that I have received from doctors, but particularly from nurses. I realize that nurses, I always say this, are the only people who can prescribe care. It was a nurse who said that once to me a long time ago. They're so right. They have always been extremely affirming and extremely kind. I've had a situation which has been very affirming but was really frightening, and that was when I started to get a neurogenic bladder with my last relapse, and the urologist was brilliant, but he was like, listen, you gotta pee in this bucket and you gotta get enough out. He's like, or else we're gonna need to do catheterization, and I was like, okay, give me a sec. So I went and pee in this bucket as best I can. Couldn't manage it, clearly, just massive urinary failure, and I went back in, and he gave me an ultrasound and was like, there's still liquid in there, we're gonna have to teach you to intermittently catheterize. And I was like, suddenly I was like, oh gosh, like, I've, for everyone at home, hi y'all, I've had surgery. It's not a secret. So my form is sculpted and not born. But I was like, the fact that I'm trans is known in this space, right? They know I'm trans, and I'm going to have a nurse come and teach me to do this most intimate, most frightening thing without any like, I don't know who this person is going to be or whether they're going to be okay. And there's always the risk, right, that they're not going to be very kind. And mercifully, the nurse that he got, she said to me immediately, she was like, oh, I have a friend who's trans, and she's actually, on the road to the surgery herself. And I was like, what is the chances of that? And she was wonderful. Like, it was a weird experience. Like, it was playing pin the tail on the donkey like I did when I was a child, except I was the donkey and the tail was a disposable catheter, just like poking. It's like, is that it? Nope. And before long, we had a map of the anatomy, a team of people all around my nether regions searching for my urethra, like they're cave divers. Just like there's me pointing out local geometry, like I'm David Attenborough. On the left there, you'll see the labia minora. It was fun. And eventually she finds it and we drain the bladder, and the urologist is like, you're going to have to learn to do this and do it yourself twice a day. But that was a classic moment where I was just like, this is the most vulnerable I have ever been, I think. I was the most vulnerable I have ever been, where, he's like, you're going to have to get undressed, lower half. We'll put a cover over you to keep you as, private as we can. But we're going to need to go and teach you how to find this thing, which is difficult for even nurses and doctors to find in women. Like, it's hard. And that was scary. But I got to say, it was wonderful. What about you? Has your access been, don't have to talk about urology, but maybe.
Well, actually, so I don't really mind. Basically, the most vulnerable I've been was, so in 2022, I got the news, you probably have MS. We're going to send your file to neurology. 6 months later, neurology finally got in touch with me, by which point things had actually progressed significantly just in that 6 months. So I was a bit annoyed at neurology, but they eventually said, look, it's easiest thing to do is to get you into hospital for a few days. We'll come back to that for a few days and we'll run a few tests and we'll, sort everything out. A few days turned into most of a month. They gave me a lumbar puncture, had I don't know how many MRIs.
Wow.
Oh yeah, lumbar puncture, proper spinal tap stuff, literally. So it was no fun. But one of the things that happened while I was there, well, several of the things that happened while I was there, if staff misgendered me, they would immediately be corrected by their colleagues, sometimes quite sharply, and like, oh, thank you. And I didn't have to say anything. The conversation was barely even had, but it was just kind of known and accepted in the file. I guess the one slight stumbling block was at one point, I fell in the shower, so I pulled the alarm. It was just a slippery floor, and I went over. It happens. So I pulled the alarm, and it didn't work. The alarm actually wasn't plugged in in the room in my ward. So I was like, hello, banging on the wall. So eventually I ended up with like 12 people in the room kind of helping me, and several people stood behind, and it's like, okay, I am naked and on view to a dozen people here. I'm not bothered about this. I don't care for it. I'm not that much of an exhibitionist, particularly not while I just trying to have a shower, So, I think for the most part, the actual staff within the NHS have been tremendous. Definitely the nurses. Or more power to them, to be perfectly honest. Give them all of the pay rises. So how easy have you found it to explain your needs to other people in terms of your MS? Have you always been able to kind of, be your own advocate?
Yeah, that's a cool question. I think over time I've realized how much of an advocate you have to become, because I think, even with gender stuff, people generally can find it hard to imagine what it would be like to have a gender identity that is at odds with how you were assigned or how your body is developed. People find that really difficult, but they can just about get their head around it. But things like fatigue, for example, people have a sort of sense of tiredness, and they're like, similar to tiredness. Absolutely not. Like a completely separate experience, and a very, discrete little experience. It's quite difficult to explain to people. So those kind of moments are actually really tricky to explain to people. I think the problem is, akin to like gender stuff, I think people are taught in school mostly through experience when they're growing up, what bodies are like and what gender is like and what, and what wheelchairs are and the people who use them. And so people don't expect, like I was going through TSA in the States, getting my bags checked as I was getting on a plane. And he was like, you've got the wheelchair, we'll wand you down. And I was like, I can walk. And he was like, what? So I just stood up. And he was like, what is happening?
It's a miracle.
My goodness. Did I do that? Yeah, wild experience. But I think it's like those kinds of things, the assumptions that people have about what a wheelchair is and why you might use one, and that you might be able to walk somewhat and on some days, but not far enough to be able to manage an airport. So a wheelchair, it's those kind of things that I think are hard to explain to people when we don't do a very good job of teaching people about these kind of experiences. I think that's the big problem, and you're constantly transgressing the boundaries. You find this similar?
I think I've not had too much of a trouble kind of explaining myself for the most part, I think, because some days it depends how tired you are, and it depends on what your symptoms are like, because sometimes if I've particularly slept badly and I'm having a very rough day symptoms wise, I have difficulty communicating that I would like some breakfast. Never mind the idea that I might need to communicate some kind of high level medical information. So I think for the most part, I've done all right. Like, I'm a podcaster for a reason. I can talk for England. I think both of us can, as this interview demonstrates. But I don't think, I think people understand if you're kind of having trouble getting your words out. Like, people get it, particularly if you're in a wheelchair, and people are they're a little bit more patient with you, aren't they? I find. I mean, some people aren't, but those people are a class unto themselves, and we should probably just kind of discount their opinions about it, really, because if they're going to get impatient with a wheelchair user, what else will they get annoyed about? But I think for the most part, people are prepared to give you a little bit extra time, a bit more space to kind of think and put your thoughts together. So it's kind of depended really on what the situation is around. Context is everything, isn't it?
Context is everything. Yeah. I was in, I went to a Japanese tea garden in California in my wheelchair. And it was a classic moment of like where the context and the people's sort of assumptions about what it meant that you're in a wheelchair kind of really messed with the situation. Because I wheeled in and the guy at the front desk was like, listen, this place is only about 40% accessible. So we're going to, not charge you to come in. We're going to give it to you for free, but you've got to bear in mind it's not really accessible. I was like, no problem, thanks very much. I wheeled myself in. I was like, well, now I can't just get out of my wheelchair and walk around, right? So I can walk it up. Can't just be like, oh, thanks, I can get in for free, great, and then just stand up and start strolling around. So I was like, but I'm a bad disabled person. Like, if I see a set of stairs and I've got a wheelchair, and I can't walk for whatever reason, I'm going to try and tackle those set of stairs. So I did, and I got up the first step and couldn't get up the second because, of course, I couldn't. And then this woman charged at me in like superhero mode. She like said to a friend, sorry, I got this. And she just ran over and she grabbed me and the wheelchair and carried me in my wheelchair, a good 100 kilograms up these stairs. Incredible. And I didn't want to say to her, listen, I can walk.
Just sometimes you just got to give them the win, haven't you?
I mean, you can't convince a hero not to save you, right?
So we've been talking about transitions just now in terms of transitioning to using a wheelchair. So I have read that you've said before that being LGBTQ plus and disabled can feel like an extreme sport. So what did you mean by that?
I've been thinking about this a lot recently, particularly with regards to MS, because like we talked right where we started our conversation was like, we are quite close to danger at any given moment, right? The potential for worsening or relapses or falling or something happening. We're always a little bit closer to the edge than most people. And sometimes I feel like being that close to the edge, it can be a bit difficult to think of anything else. Like you can hear the waves crashing below, and it can fill your ears and make it hard to kind of, like, the entropy of it all is just a little bit too close. And I was thinking about extreme sports people live that close to the edge deliberately because it makes them feel alive. It makes them feel connected. It's where they most live, is that close to the edge. And I think there's a terrible gift in there with being like LGBT, where the world is just constantly at risk of, you're always at risk of people like discriminating against you, or just not even like that, just thinking negatively of you, and maybe passing comment or just rejecting you outright. And MS is like, you're always that close to the edge. And I feel like I want to find a place psychologically where I'm not just scared, though I think I will always be scared. I really want to get to a place where I feel alive because I'm this close to the edge. Does that make sense?
Yes. No, I know what you mean. And in terms of the unfortunate things that can happen, like, you know, comments from people chucking stuff at you, like it's happened. It's happened to me. It's happened to you. It's happened to quite a lot of LGBTQ plus people. I mean, and particularly trans people, but let's get into that in a minute. I do see what you mean, I think, but there's also a kind of beauty to it, because of the defiance and being able to stand up and say, well, this is me, and you might not like it, but I don't care. I'm not living for you. I'm living for myself.
Hell yes, absolutely. And there's something about like that shared experience is so kind of rare that there's opportunity for genuine, authentic connection when you meet someone else who's like standing that close to the edge or living that defiantly. And I love it. It's like a kinship of the defiant.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another spaceship name that we see how many more we can fit in. A mission of great enterprise. Okay, so have you found your kind of local LGBTQ plus community to be an accessible space? Because I have struggled with that at times, I think.
I don't think disabled inclusion, generally speaking, is a problem of big discriminatory experiences. I think it's a problem of 1,000 cuts. It's like, oh, the bar isn't super accessible and my wheelchair can't get in, or the toilets are upstairs, or, you know, it's super loud and gets a bit difficult for me to hear, or whatever it is. And so you are reluctant to go to those places in small ways, like just a little more reluctant and just a bit more friction. And when there's enough friction, the whole process becomes a bit abrasive, and so you don't go. And I think if we don't go, then people don't see us. And if people don't see us, then they don't see like out trans people, LGBTQ plus people in the world and living and realizing that it's actually possible to do that and to be successful and to, you know, and to live defiantly. So I think it's really important that we do it. But it is, I think what would help is if these spaces were a touch more, like they just had a mind to accessibility when they created these events, or even just when you open a bar or a pub somewhere, you open it and you think, you know, oh, we seem to have put the toilets upstairs. That's going to be a problem. How do we manage that?
Like, in terms of that community, then I've had a bit of trouble connecting with LGBTQ plus people who also have MS. Have you found that difficult? I mean, there can't be that many of us, surely.
I think that's fundamentally the problem. I guess it's like, what is it? 1 in 500 people have MS. It's got to be like 2 or 3% are going to be LGBTQ. But when you're talking about like gender diverse folk, it's probably closer to 1% or 2%, I guess. Especially if it's young folk. So those two, that intersection has got to be a tiny group of people nationally. And so I don't know that it's easy for us to find each other. I mean, I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of trans people I've met with MS. You're one of them, literally, like a handful of people. And even like when I have come across people, it's not like there are opportunities to say, hey, I'm trans. Are you are you trans? Like, that's not the kind of thing that you say to people. Hey, I noticed that, your voice sounds a bit like mine. Are you trans? Like, so even though we might exist and might find each other in passing, it's not very easy to, like, there's no easy space to say, oh, here are the trans folk with MS, like joining up and creating community and making sure that nobody feels alone. I think that'd be a wonderful thing, but I haven't found a space that does it quite yet.
As you say, that kind of the intersection of trans and MS is, of course, it's been difficult to find, because how many of us can there be, really? You are the only other trans person with MS that I know. How do you go out and make those connections, right? So that means you have to then go to one of those events, and that means that, well, is that event definitely going to be accessible? And you'd think it would be if it says, looking for queer people who also consider themselves to be disabled, right? You'd think that would be held somewhere where there's at least a lift and no steps, but it's not always the case, unfortunately. Yes, we were looking for disabled people, but you're too disabled because we don't have a lift. Like, right, okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really tricky. It is just really tricky. But I will say that the one thing that I have found is that that compulsion to not do the thing has been a very strong influence on my life. And it took me a while of using a wheelchair before I realized, because I was getting strong, I was doing all kinds of stuff like going out, but I was more reserved. I just wasn't doing these things. I wasn't connecting with people. And even when I was going out, I was more reserved when I did. And that, I went to Vienna in the wheelchair. I took myself off to go to a conference and meet a bunch of people, and I knew no one there. And when I did, we ended up at a drinks reception in the center of Vienna. And every step of the way, I was like, maybe I should just go back to the hotel. Maybe I should just go back. Maybe, this is too much. You didn't ask for this to try and help me. And people, I felt like as I always do, I felt like a burden. But what I realized was that, they were there and they wanted me there. And what they were doing wasn't an act of charity. It was a labor of love. And so they bundled me in this tiniest elevator you've ever seen, like with my wheelchair, like on top of me, as I had to get up to this drinks reception in the center of Vienna. It was a wonderful night. I had a great time. I met some absolutely wonderful people. I have felt more connected than I have done in a while. And I just realized how often I do that kind of, maybe I shouldn't, maybe I'll just go back. Maybe it's safer not to. Maybe then I'm not so much of a burden. But it just prohibits people from loving you, in ways that allow you to be included.
What do you think other people with MS or without MS, what do you think they could learn from our experiences?
I love that question. What I really like is what you said earlier about the defiance. Like, living authentically is something that, when I transitioned, and I guess when we all transition, we are transgressing a set of unspoken rules and norms of society that say, oh, men are men and women are women, and you're assigned at birth and that's what you are, and then there's a set of sort of expectations about what men can and should be and what women can and should be that are often quite restrictive and problematic even in themselves, even for cisgender people, people who aren't trans. And then there comes along us as we just transgress all of those rules just to live in the world. And then, the transition to becoming disabled is like a similar transition. I mean, we didn't get to choose, but I don't really know if we chose to be trans either. So I think there's a beautiful thing in realizing that there are a bunch of norms, like ableist norms about what bodies should be and what people should be able to do, and the world that's set up for the kind of body that's expected. And our bodies were always different. And so I hope that maybe we find it a little easier to just kind of live authentically and just be like, no, this is us. We'll transgress those norms, transgress them before. So I think people who are not trans, people who aren't disabled, I think could learn a great deal from the freedom that comes from realizing that those norms are not the only way to live in this world.
Agreed. And I think so it touches on, just to pick up on what you said about transitioning to using a wheelchair, right? I actually thought at the time, it's like, well, I've already transitioned in one way, and after that, anything else is a cakewalk. And it was genuinely like I adapted really quickly to needing to use a wheelchair, because partly I resigned myself to it, yes, but also partly I was like, well, you know, the one constant of the universe is change, right? So why spend so long worrying about something and just kind of get on and do it, is my theory, I think.
I think there is beauty in that change, especially when those changes are about living more authentically, right? Because these are, I mean, life is in the transitions, and change is inevitable. I do think that is true. And I do look at some of my friends, I adore them, and their lives are so stable. They're so, you know, safe, and their lives are wonderful. I don't lament them that. But for me, in my life, I have found such joy in the opportunity to be authentic and in the changes that came that allowed me to do that. And I still, like, I was in California not that long ago with family, and I remember being in the car with my sister-in-law, and she was like talking to me about, you know, the journey of being trans. She bought me my first makeup tutorial when we were out there 10 years ago, and I remember saying to her that I am so glad of all these changes, including disability. Fine, you know, it just, even in spite of all of that, maybe because of all of that, I still can't believe I get to live this life.
I'm so glad I get to do this. Yeah, I do. The life that I've got, that I've built for myself, is amazing, and I wouldn't swap it for the world. Admittedly, yes, I think I would try and swap out the disabled part if I could, but that's only because I miss doing gigs.
The difficulty can come from like maybe the focus that we have so heavily on the idea of dysphoria, this idea, you know, that being trans is this kind of mournful experience, as you know, that you feel that you aren't the gender on the inside that people think you are on the outside. But what I think people don't realize is that on the other side of all this, the opportunity to live authentically to what feels like home on the inside is a joyous, euphoric experience. And my sense is that, you know, we're talking about, like, when we talk about disability, people are starting to talk about autistic joy, and starting potentially to start talking about disabled joy. When the world is as inclusive as it needs to be, maybe we can find the beauty in being disabled too. Not to say I wouldn't take a cure tomorrow. I absolutely would. If the, you know, no hesitation. But maybe there is joy in this. Maybe we can find that silver lining in the same way that, you know, being trans and being out and living defiantly brings an extraordinary amount of joy.
I think that's an excellent note to end on. Dr. Cora Sargent, thank you so much for joining us. For a very long time, lots of people with MS, including trans people, haven't really been represented at all. It's as if we've become invisible. But anyone can get MS, and however MS affects you, whatever background you're from, you won't be the only one. There will be other people sharing similar experiences. If you'd like to chat to other people living with MS, you can visit mssociety.org.uk/forum. you can check out the MS Society's community blogs at mssociety.org.uk/blogs. Thank you so much for joining me in this mini-series. If you'd like to hear more from me, Ashley Talbot, on living with progressive MS, you can find our other episodes on the MS Society's website or wherever you get your podcasts from. And please do subscribe too. You can also find more stories and information about living with progressive MS at mssociety.org.uk. Thank you so much for tuning in. Goodbye.